This is Third Paradigm, and I'm Teresa Caraggio. Today, I want to go deeper into my last episode where I talked about reversing the reset and quoted some from Putin's speech in St. Petersburg. In response to that, I got two great comments, many, but two I'm going to talk about today, which I call the Gan and Stan game show. Gan is a very astute viewer who comments on my YouTube channel, and Stan is another astute viewer who comments on Substack. They both brought up issues that they have with Putin and whether Putin is a part of this whole Great Reset. So I want to look more at his policies that he talks about in his speech and make it into a game, into something where we look at whether we could come up with better policies if we wanted to create the sovereignty and the self-reliance of our own communities. So let's go deeper. Gan talks about how he believes cooperation and competition are both necessary to be balanced in order to make progress, and I couldn't agree more. All I have ever wanted was a fair fight where we determine what are the goals that we want to accomplish with our economic system and how do we measure progress. And I just want to throw my economic model into the ring and let it battle it out, because I think that there are easy answers if you're asking the right questions. A link that Stan posted sent me to a panel discussion that included Catherine Austin Fitts, someone whose goals I agree with completely in terms of livable small communities. Her measure of success for a community is the popsicle test. Can you send a kid to the closest place to get a popsicle and feel safe? Now, I think that's lovely, but way too nebulous as a test. So what I do is I look at how many times you can put money into the economy and have it circulate, creating new economic productivity before it migrates out. And so the policies that I look at are all to increase the amount of exchanges before it's actually siphoned out. The way that Putin is doing this is by looking at import substitution, making sure that all of the things that are being imported, they can produce in Russia. And he says it's not good enough to just copy what someone else is doing, even if it's a good copy, that they need to be making advances in technology and developing new things like the rocket that took things to an entirely different level. The US, I learned from Putin, is going in the opposite direction. That in the last 2 years, our imports have gone from $250 billion a month to $350 billion a month. So that's a 40% increase, which matches the amount that the money supply was multiplied in that time, that it added $6 trillion, which raised it by, again, 40%. And that's the number that we need to pay attention to as policy wonks for our own communities. What is the level of food and energy imports that we're dependent on, and then also goods? That's our starting point, and we need to be measuring that so that we know by how much we need to bring it down. Gan mentioned that in Maine, he's part of a micro community, and he uses that labor force to organize it and increase the productivity so that there's more security for the homestead and also for the community. But he would love the opportunity to be a snowbird and to travel during the long winters and know that things are going to be okay. And also, he'd love to build a cultural center that would have space for dance and music and martial arts. These are things that I've thought a lot about, because you can't be a community without a place to gather. And so if we were using eminent domain, we could take back places within our neighborhoods. Every neighborhood could have its own meeting center and be a place that you could celebrate, that you could talk, that you could have a library, that you could have a cafe, that you could have pop-up dinners, that you could have your bank branch, because that's what's going to fund all of this activity. And remember, every debt that you create, if you own the money and you're issuing the mortgages, is a debt that you're creating to yourself. It creates jobs. It's a means of organizing labor in exactly the way that Gan is already doing, except that it backs it up with the mortgage rather than that being something that extracts labor. The panel discussion also talks about how more and more people are moving towards small communities and growing their own food and being interdependent with each other. And that's lovely, but as I say in questioning the greater reset, it's not enough. We need to have a way of organizing labor. We can't just hand all the properties and all the labor to the banks and then expect that we're going to be able to take care of ourselves and each other. So what Putin does are things that I think are brilliant, that he looks at insurances as being something that is owned by the state, that the state can then be able to defer payments and, in effect, give businesses a loan in order to pay it back over a longer period of time and have this be something where they're protected. I've thought that every way that money is made from money should belong to the state. And by state, I mean the community. And then all ways that money is made from labor should belong to the individual. So he looks at partnerships between entrepreneurs and small businesses and these larger state subsidized industries, that they need to develop a plan where they are encouraging individual entrepreneurship and reducing the amount of bureaucracy so that someone can't be milked for payoffs in a corrupt system, that instead there is no shutting someone down because they don't have a license, that there's no regime of audits, constant audits that are just routine. And so he's bringing these things and getting them out of the way so that new ideas can flourish. In my plan, I do something similar. I think all insurances should be owned by the Commonwealth. So that, for instance, in California, where I am, you might buy earthquake insurance. And because the Commonwealth creates the money, they can use it in the meantime to give subsidies to help homeowners make their properties more resilient. You could have healthcare subsidies that then gets put into clinics and developing equipment that brings the cost of healthcare down. I also think that infrastructure should be owned by the Commonwealth. So, for instance, there should only be one phone network in terms of the hardware, and that should be owned by the state. But when it comes to providing services, any entrepreneur should be able to buy into that and be able to use their labor to be able to provide the best services on that common network that is maintained by the Commonwealth. Putin also talks about putting money into cultural centers, especially in small towns and rural areas. And he looks at creating eco-friendly villages and spaces that need to be created with eco-sensitivity in their municipalities. So reducing the hazardous emissions in large cities and taking places that have been polluted by industries like paper mills and turning them into a model of green energy and sustainable development. Putin looks at upgrading housing and utility networks, which he says 40% of them need to be improved. They're looking at replacing roads over the next 5 years. And they're doing this with infrastructure loans that are 3% for 15 years. And that's something that is similar to what the Bank of North Dakota was doing with their money, that they create this low interest lending that goes from city to city within North Dakota and is able to improve and have cities not be able to borrow from banks in order to get the things that they need done. A major goal that Putin has set for the government is to reduce the amount of inequality. And the major long-term way of doing that is to increase demand for Russian-made products across Russia. But in the meantime, also protecting the vulnerable, which he sees as pensioners and families with children and those in difficult life circumstances. So he does this protection by raising both the minimum wage and the subsistence level, which is the index that different benefits are tied to, and increasing pensions ahead of inflation. So pensions have increased twice already this year, including 10% on June 1st. And that makes sure that they stay ahead of the things that they can actually buy with that money. Over the last few years, Russia has instituted plans that support families. And so women are entitled to state support from the early months of pregnancy through the time their child is 17. But Putin is alarmed that over the last couple years, the birth rate in Russia has dropped by 13%. And so he is tasking government with looking at a holistic system of education and healthcare and all of the things that can be done to support families. Because what he says is that Russia's future is ensured by families with 2, 3, or more children. And since the reset is mostly about dispossession and depopulation, I think that couldn't be more counter. In the panel discussion, Catherine Fitz says that she doesn't think that Russia could be doing what it's doing without the help of the West. She also sees all of the fiat currencies as about to implode. But she admits that Russia has all of the sources of power, from food to energy to economics, and the ruble is backed by real trade. What Russia is asking for is that countries that buy its products give it real trade in return, rather than the bubblegum wrappers, which is what it calls the imperial currencies of the dollar, the pound, and the euro. Putin tells regional and municipal governments that their job is to support entrepreneurs and local small businesses. And he says there are successes, things like popular software and locally produced organic food and local goods that are marketed nationally using domestic websites. And so these are things that I think we should all be doing. That is the idea for having something that is interactive, but you know that your city, that your state is on your side and is wanting to support you in being self-sufficient and self-employed. And the last point I'll cite is when he talks to large business owners and says, which will be more important to your heirs, inheriting money and property or a good name? If you have a reputation that they can be proud of, that's going to do more for them. And I think this brings up the idea I've had of a maximum wage. To me, every family should be like a corporation where you have operating expenses and you have what needs to be taken care of. But you only have a certain discretionary income from that that goes to each person every month. And nothing can exceed that. And that means that if you're going to have more, you might as well give it away because you've already met your goals for what you need to put away for your retirement, what you need to add to your savings to supplement your Social Security. And you know that you can do that for the rest of your life, that your children will be able to be secure and at a point where they can produce themselves and carry on the good name that you've established for them. So I think this is opposite of the agenda of the Great Reset, as is evident by another post from Kanakoa the Great on COVID vaccines and infertility. It shows that in 1 year, the birth rate in the UK has declined by 8%, in Germany by 13%, and in Taiwan by 23%. So, if we want to develop a policy of repossession and repopulation, I think we need to follow Putin's lead when we develop our own community economies and look at them supporting families and home ownership and small local businesses. If you'd like to contrast this to US policies, here's the West versus the rest, and here's Putin's peace and US petropocalypse. Thank you, Gan and Stan, for your provocative, engaging questions, and thank you for viewing all the way to the end.